May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. You confused me when you started with that reading. Thank you for reading. But I was planning on starting by talking about David. And this reading just didn't seem to fit. Who are God's people? We have 3 readings today that are all about who are God's people. And in every case, the answer is not what God's people think it should be. We have David here, God's anointed king, saying he wants to set up a temple for God. Putting his mark on God's worship. And what's God's answer to him? Oh, there can be a temple, but you won't build it. It won't happen in your lifetime. It's a good idea, maybe. But until now, my people have been content to worship me in tents. Have been content to worship me wherever they are. I have not been put in a house. I'll allow myself to be put in a house, but it won't be you that does it. It'll be your son after you're dead. And then we have Paul's letter to the Ephesians. All that stuff about the uncircumcised and the circumcised. The Jews and the Gentiles. God's historically chosen people. And the people who were the stranger. Who you were supposed to treat well but never fully accept. And now they're God's people too. And in some ways, even more God's people. The circumcised can become just as much God's people as the uncircumcised, but not the way they've always done it. And then we have our reading from Mark, where Jesus and the disciples head across the Galilee to get away from the mobs that are thronging them. And what do they find on the other side of the Galilee? Where they thought they could have peace. Get away from it for a while. Yet more people looking for that good news. People they didn't even think might possibly follow them. These are people that have no experience with the God of Abraham. Or at least not, and they've heard of the God of Abraham. But they're not the people who have been living amongst them, even as strangers. They're those people from away. And they have heard about what Jesus is doing, about what Jesus means. They've heard about this good news. And they're God's people too. In every case, the people who consider themselves God's people are shown that their view is too small. That view of owning God, of God being my personal God, is just wrong. It may be right for that person, but it's not God's vision. And in all of these readings, those who are shown a different vision, are they happy about that different vision? I don't think so. I think they're kind of resistant of it. David certainly was not happy to hear that he was not going to be allowed to build the temple. I can see him asking Samuel to pray again, get a different answer. This can't be right. You must have heard wrong. And the circumcised, the Jews, who throughout their history had been told over and over again that you are God's chosen people, you and you alone, and I will support you against all of your enemies. Being told, well, those people that you've considered your enemies are my people too. And I'll support them as well. Just as much as you. What do you think they felt about that? This oppressed people. Because at this time, the Jews were still very much an oppressed people. Being told that, some of these that are your oppressors, they're following me too. They're also my people. So I'll support you against injustice, but not against them as a people. I'll support them against injustice too. And the disciples. I don't think Jesus was surprised. But the disciples, who thought that they were going to get some peace and quiet for a while, that they would have some alone time with their teacher, some 1-on-12 instruction. They go across this lake, big enough lake that they call it a sea. And on the other side, it's more of the same. They can't get away from it. They can't get away from people's need. Because that's what it is that on the other side of the lake, people are every bit in as much need as they were on their own side. There's injustice that needs to be addressed. There are poor. There are sick. There are needy. And as God's chosen people, no matter where we go, we can't ignore that. It will be brought to our attention. So, we live in a time when we have built houses for God. We worship in these houses. But we need to remember the message of these stories. This may be what we call God's house, where we gather in our way with our God. But out there is every bit as much God's house. And everyone out there is every bit as much God's chosen. And we don't get to say, but they're not us, so we can not pay attention. We don't get to just cling to our own community and ignore the rest. Our most important time with God is not in here. God is with the people. God dwells in tents for those that can't afford housing. God dwells wherever, even for those that can't afford tents. God is with all those who have been displaced by wildfires. Thankfully, most of them are now able to go home, those that have homes to go back to. God is with those in our society who see the greatest injustice, far more than those of us who live with justice, for the most part. We're not oppressed. Sometimes looking at our government, I think I am oppressed, but we're not oppressed. We're quite well off. Which means that we're the ones that need to be looking for these places. The places in the wilderness. And the wilderness can be next door, where people don't have enough, where there is need, sickness, injustice. And saying, you are God's chosen. You are loved. And since I follow Christ, I can do nothing except love you too. Thanks be to God.